Hello, I'm Jonas Czerwiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia is not trying to persuade Ukrainians in occupied territories to become Russian. It is trying to make any other option impossible. The Kremlin's preferred tool is not a referendum, a speech, or even a soldier with a rifle, but a passport, because a passport determines who can work, who can move, who can see a doctor, and who can stay. What we are watching is a deliberate campaign to erase Ukrainian civic life by turning citizenship into a survival requirement. And once citizenship becomes mandatory, refusal itself becomes ground for removal. Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The Kremlin's war effort against Ukraine extends beyond the battlefield and into the lives of Ukrainians living in Russian-occupied regions. With approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory currently occupied, Moscow has found a variety of ways to subjugate these regions' populations and attempt to Russify them. One such method is forced passportization, whereby Russian authorities distribute passports to residents of Ukraine's occupied regions. In an effort to coerce the Ukrainian population into accepting these Russian passports, the Kremlin has mandated that basic services and property rights in occupied regions be linked to Russian citizenship. Now, those in occupied regions who do not have Russian passports may face expulsion. A March 2025 decree signed by Vladimir Putin mandated that Ukrainians living in Russian-occupied territories must either legalize themselves by obtaining Russian passports or leave the territory by September 10, 2025. Moscow has also sought to completely dominate media in Ukraine's occupied regions, including by physically removing Ukrainian satellite dish infrastructure. In turn, Russian media and telecommunications companies have expanded into occupied regions. Analysts say that these combined moves are intended to politically and economically subjugate the Ukrainian population under occupation. By erasing any remnants of previous civic presence and demographically reshaping occupied regions, the Kremlin has shown that waging war against its neighbor goes beyond artillery battles.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. The Kremlin's push to force Ukrainians in occupied regions to become Russians extends beyond adults. It also applies to children. In fact, Moscow's forced Russification policies are often specifically aimed at Ukrainian kids, seeking to target them while their identities are seemingly malleable. As always, here is a closer look.
In Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine, local schools have become a primary means of propagandizing children. Both students and teachers alike face coercion by occupying authorities to conform to the Russian curriculum, use the Russian language, and pledge allegiance to Russia. In June 2025, Russian media reported an order to remove all Ukrainian language from schools in Ukraine's occupied regions. Russian authorities also maintain a network of military and indoctrination camps in occupied Ukraine as well as in Russia. Ukrainian children are often forcibly sent to these camps, where they are taught to accept a Russian militarized identity. The Kremlin's fixation on indoctrinating children in occupied regions highlights the extent to which Moscow will fight to shape identities. Through manipulation and outright force, Russia seeks to cultivate a generation of Ukrainian children loyal to their occupier.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Passportization sounds administrative, even dull. In reality, though, it is one of the Kremlin's most effective instruments of territorial control. By mass distributing Russian passports in occupied Ukrainian territories, Moscow is enforcing submission through paperwork. Last year, the Kremlin formally concluded its forced passportization campaign across occupied parts of Ukraine. Russian leader Vladimir Putin framed this as a technical necessity to, and I quote, settle the legal status of residents. In practice, it marked the transition from coercion to punishment. From that point onwards, anyone without a Russian passport ceased to exist legally in the territories Russia controls. This was never about having a choice. For years, occupation authorities systematically tied basic human needs to Russian citizenship. Without a Russian passport, Ukrainians cannot access pensions, employment, social benefits, education, or even healthcare. Mobile phone service now requires Russian identification. Ukrainian media access is blocked and satellite dishes are banned. Bureaucracy replaces brute force, but the effect is the same: compliance or exclusion. The logic here is simple. If every interaction with the state requires a Russian passport, daily life itself becomes an enforcement mechanism. People apply not because they believe, but because they need insulin, salaries, or a functioning phone for that matter. The Kremlin has now extended this system to children as well. New Russian exit and entry regulations remove birth certificates as valid travel documents for minors under 14 in occupied territories. The result of that is clear. Ukrainian children can legally cross borders only if they hold Russian documentation. This closes the last remaining non-passport exit route and locks families into Russia's legal space. Childhood becomes another area of administrative capture. Property rights are the next pressure point. Occupation authorities require property to be re-registered under Russian law, which, you guessed it, also requires Russian citizenship. Homes not properly registered risk being declared abandoned. Utility debts can trigger confiscation. In October 2025, Moscow formally legalized property seizures in occupied territories and enabled redistribution to imported Russian officials, teachers, and security personnel. Passportization thus enables demographic engineering. Once the deadline passed, enforcement escalated. And then came administrative expulsions. Ukrainians who refused to settle their legal status began receiving formal deportation orders. Refusal to become Russian is now treated as a migration violation inside one's own home. This strategy has precedent. Russia used passportization in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, and parts of the Donbass before. What is different now is scale, speed, and totality. The Kremlin is no longer testing this model, it is institutionalizing it. The Kremlin's message to Ukrainians under occupation is blunt: become Russian or disappear. This is coercive statecraft at its most efficient. And joining us now to shed more light on the issue is Witold Rotkiewicz, Senior Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure.
So let's begin with a question that may seem controversial for some, although perhaps it shouldn't be. In many studies, what Russia is doing in occupied regions of Ukraine is being described using various euphemisms like demographic engineering. But shouldn't this really be a conversation about ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think ethnic cleansing is not a right term. Social engineering, I think it's a good term. Perhaps what's the problem with this term? It does not really suggest or does not necessarily include the amount of force that's used in conducting this what I would call, in parentheses, engineering. It's a forcible engineering, I would say. The essence of this is to basically turn the local population, which is Ukrainian, although mostly Russian-speaking, into basically loyal citizens of Russia, and to Russify, change its identity and change its culture, political culture especially. And this is conducted. This is done by a number of very sort of comprehensive measures. One is to try to separate and liquidate, deport or terrorize those who I would call the active element. Those people who are attached to their Ukrainian identity and who are ready to defend it. openly
There
or
is an
passively.
aspect of forced removal, right? But we also have an aspect of
Yes,
relocating
there is
Russians from, other regions of Russia into these regions. In Crimea, this process is already ongoing and quite advanced, with the majority of the majority of the population likely to become
Yeah,
Russian within the next couple of years. So
this is
how does
a-
it differ? How does it differ from ethnic cleansing? If we don't, obviously we don't have mass executions and stuff like that, although we
because
do have torture chambers.
ethnic
So what
cleansing,
is the...
because by the difference with ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing means that you deport basically the population that's of a wrong ethnic of wrong ethnic character. Here you don't, you deport only a relatively small number of people, but you try to pressure the rest of it and to influence the rest of it to switch their identity. So that's in a way it's worse, or it's one might say.
Because the switch isn't voluntary, right? I mean, it's enforced by, as you've mentioned, a variety of administrative measures.
Yes.
If you don't have a Russian passport, you basically cannot live in these areas. You cannot get health service, you cannot travel freely, you cannot get a job, and so on and so on. So where is the voluntary aspect? Essentially being forced into adopting a different identity.
I never said that it was voluntary. I said it was involuntary. And of course, one part, what you mentioned is a legal aspect, that is forcible acquisition of Russian citizenship. Because please remember, these people were Ukrainian citizens, and from the legal point of view, they still are. But what I'm talking about has to do more with identity, by suppression of all the demonstrations of loyalty to Ukrainian nation, and also by the school system, which is completely Russified. The textbooks are brought from Russia. All the signs, or the sort of kind of like libraries are being censored, are being purged of books that are seen as being the carriers of Ukrainian national identity. The language, officially, the Ukrainian language is preserved. It has an official status, but in fact, Russian is absolutely predominant, and I think the situation there is that the use of Ukrainian, public use of Ukrainian, is being met by informal coercion and pressure. So it's a very comprehensive system which has its roots and owes a lot of, almost all of it. It's within the Russian imperial and Soviet tradition. I mean, the Russian Empire has a centuries-old tradition of pressuring the conquered population into accepting Russian identity, Russian citizenship, and becoming loyal or at least obedient subjects of the Russian state. So
you've mentioned children. I mean, with children, it's especially drastic, one could say, as a measure, because children are not really able to resist this sort of pressure, this sort of coercion that's being applied. And apart from being brainwashed, it has been confirmed that children are also effectively being prepared for future roles in the Russian military.
Of Germany,
yes.
If you go back to the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, German policies in the Polish province of Poznań, you would see very similar approach. I mean, the idea is to assimilate the population, change its national identity, make it so. It's a kind of the type of policy that was in Europe in times of nation building was quite normal. The difference is, of course, that in the German case, The state was more or less a Rechtsstaat, a state. It was done according to strict legal regulations, and sort of overt violence, was not used. Here we are dealing with a situation in which the structures of power, the police, the National Guard, the army, is practically a free hand to use violence and to use sort of arbitrary violent measures, extra legal measures to terrorize people and to make them to come to a conclusion that it's better, it's safer just to follow the orders and to do what they are expected to do by the Russian authorities than to resist and to try to show some resistance or even passive resistance. But of course, with policies of this type, a lot of depends on the time frame. I mean, if you conduct such a policy, in some cases it can be, we have historical cases where such policies were effective, but in most cases these were not effective policies. As the history of such attempts at forcible assimilation and change of identity. Well, the Ukraine is a good point itself, and the Baltic states, and even Poland is a good example of that. And there are other cases that you can point out. So I think
we can only see that with the benefit of hindsight, though. I mean, what's happening right now can still be prevented. Do you think international law is powerless to do anything about it, as it is happening,
yes,
as people are suffering under these policies?
Of course, the international law is powerless. We have a situation we have a war situation. And the only way to stop this is to defeat the Russian army or to break Russian economy by sanctions. There's no other way. I mean, this is the Russian side is not going to pay attention to any kind of moral censure or kind of diplomatic pressure. This is not the type of situation that it's not the type of regime, not the type of state that's going to be influenced by such measures. The other side of it is, of course, that these territories are being robbed, and people are being, the industrial potential. These were rich territories. These were in some ways highly industrialized areas. They were destroyed by the Russian military action. And then we've heard reports about machinery and stockpiles being exported, being dismantled and carried away to Russia proper. These territories also have been exploited in terms of their agriculture area. We know now that the Russians were able to send grains which were grown on these territories to help their war effort, to export it to third countries, which were, didn't care basically where this came from. It's a huge. I mean, one of the issues that one of the tracks that's possible to follow, use international legal mechanism to make it impossible for the Russian state to, for example, sell goods produced on this territory in international markets. Because from the point of the international law, this is still these are still occupied territories. That's why the Russian side is so insistent during its negotiating posture in negotiations on the ending this conflict, that Ukraine should, and this is a kind of absolute Russian condition, Ukraine should legally recognize the annexation of these territories into the Russian Federation, which I think would be which is acceptable to the Ukrainian side, of course. And I think this is we also should support the Ukrainian side in this, as we know also that the Washington administration, the Trump administration, is sometimes willing to accept these Russian demands in order to bring this conflict to an end. So,
well, unfortunately, I have to park our conversation here. Nevertheless, as you said, this is still very much a developing story concerning how the peace deal will be achieved. For the time being, Witold Rotkiewicz was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukraine's power grid suffered a cascading failure over the weekend. Electricity was cut across multiple regions and spilled over into neighboring Moldova as extreme cold grips the region.
The outage began on January 31st when two major transmission lines failed almost simultaneously, triggering automatic safety systems and forcing nuclear power plants to reduce output. Emergency blackouts followed in several Ukrainian regions, including Kyiv, where metro services stopped and water supplies were disrupted. The grid failure also knocked out power in Moldova's capital, Chisinau. Traffic lights in the capital went dark, public transportation halted, and hospitals switched to backup generators. Officials described the incident as a technical failure rather than a deliberate Russian strike, though analysts say sabotage cannot be ruled out given the grid's fragile condition after months of drone attacks.
Poland has reported a third consecutive night of balloon incursions from Belarus. On the 2nd of February, Polish military radar detected multiple objects resembling balloons entering national airspace, prompting interceptions by security forces and the detention of individuals suspected of involvement.
Authorities said the latest incursion was smaller than previous nights and posed no risk to civilian air traffic or public safety. The sightings have heightened tensions after similar incidents over the weekend led to a temporary closure of airspace along Poland's northern border with Belarus. The episodes come amid wider regional concern over aerial disruptions following a series of unidentified drone sightings across Europe in late 2025, as well as earlier Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace that sharply escalated tensions with Moscow.
Gunfire exchanges along the Tajik-Afghan border are becoming increasingly frequent. This has prompted the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization to announce plans to supply Tajik border forces with advanced weaponry.
The latest incident occurred on January 29th, when Tajik security forces clashed with suspected drug traffickers in the southern Katlan region near the Afghan border. Tajik authorities reported that 3 suspected traffickers were killed, while others fled back into Afghanistan. No casualties were reported among Tajik forces. Weapons, ammunition, and dozens of packages of narcotics were seized at the scene.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.